Welcome to the deep dive. We've got some pretty powerful pieces from Malachi this time around.
Yeah.
I'm ready to get into it.
Yeah, Malachi is definitely he doesn't pull any punches.
No, he doesn't.
It's a powerful book, and it's really interesting to think about it in its historical context.
Okay, so before we get too far, can we give a little bit of background for our listeners about, what exactly was going on during this time period?
Right. So Malachi is writing during the post-exilic period, so after the Babylonian exile.
Okay.
And this was a really tumultuous time for the Israelites.
Mm-hmm.
They had been conquered. Their temple had been destroyed. Many of them had been exiled to Babylon. And then eventually they were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild. But, things were not the same.
Right.
They were living under the thumb of the Persian Empire. And there was a lot of, disillusionment and questioning and trying to figure out, what does it mean to be God's people now?
Yeah. So Malachi is stepping into this, situation with a message that's pretty direct. Like the excerpts you sent start with this really powerful statement about God choosing Jacob over Esau.
Yeah, and it's not just, a casual mention. This is tapping into, a much larger narrative about God's covenant with Israel and their unique role in his plan.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by those recurring motifs and themes in the Old Testament, like Edom being, the descendants of Esau, almost become like this stereotypical enemy of Israel.
Right.
Why is that such a significant detail?
I think it speaks volumes about their self-perception and the way they viewed their place in the world.
Mm.
By constantly setting up this antagonist, it reinforces this idea of,
Yeah.
us versus them, this idea of being a chosen people set apart from the surrounding nations. It's a way of maintaining their identity
Okay.
when they're facing a lot of pressure to assimilate.
Interesting. And within that kind of us versus them mentality, Malachi really emphasizes God's power using these titles like Lord who rules over all. It's like a constant reminder that even with the, Persian Empire looming large, it's really God who's in control.
Yeah, exactly. It's a way of grounding their faith and giving them a sense of security amidst the chaos.
Okay.
Politically, things were not stable, but they still had their God.
So from that foundation of God's, unwavering power, we move into the section about the priests.
Right.
And wow, things get intense.
Yeah, they
He
did.
starts with this powerful analogy, the son honoring his father, the slave respecting his master, and then bam, Malachi just calls out the priest for not living up to that standard.
Yeah, he sets up this ideal of respect and reverence and understanding the vast difference between humanity and the divine. And then he pulls back the curtain and shows how the priests are treating God
Yeah.
with utter disrespect.
Like they're going through the motions of the rituals, but without any real heart behind it,
Yeah.
like offering those inadequate sacrifices.
Right, the blind, the lame, the
Yep.
sick animal.
Yeah, it's almost comical if it weren't so serious.
And there's this irony, too, because, Malachi points out that God's name is becoming great among the nations,
Oh.
but his own people, the ones chosen to represent him, are treating him with contempt.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So it's not enough to just like go through the motions.
Yeah.
You have to actually have your heart in it.
It seems to be what he's saying, yeah.
That's really interesting. There's also this one detail that I thought was fascinating. The use of the word table as like a synonym for the altar. What's going on there?
Yeah, that's not just a random word choice.
Yeah.
It connects back to this idea of covenant meals, of sacrifice being a shared meal with God.
So they're bringing like the leftovers to the table?
Pretty much. And Malachi is not mincing words in his response either.
No.
He uses some pretty jarring imagery to describe their actions,
Wow.
spreading awful on their faces.
It's pretty graphic.
Not subtle.
Why such strong language?
Well, remember, this isn't just about individual priests messing up. This is a symptom of a much larger problem. And it's a problem that goes beyond the temple walls.
So we're moving from the priests now to like the people as a whole?
That's where we see the focus shift. And unfortunately, it's not a pretty picture.
Yeah, Malachi calls out things like intermarriage with those who worship other gods.
Right.
And, that was a huge deal in the post-exilic period.
Oh, absolutely it was.
Because it wasn't just about, personal choices. It was about the survival of the Israelite community. They had lost their homeland, their temple. They were clinging to their identity as God's chosen people.
Right.
And so intermarriage was like a direct threat to that.
It was seen as a threat to their collective identity.
Which explains why the punishment was so harsh.
Right.
Being cut off from the community. That's serious.
It shows how seriously they took the threat of assimilation.
But even with those harsh consequences, it doesn't sound like there was a lot of genuine repentance happening.
No, not really.
There's that image of people weeping at the altar,
Right.
but not because they're truly sorry for their actions.
It's like they're more upset about the consequences than the sin itself.
Which makes me think about that section on divorce.
Okay.
It's presented as something God hates.
Yeah.
Almost like an act of violence. And that feels especially relevant today, given how common divorce is.
Well, if you look at it through the lens of covenant, it takes on a whole new meaning.
Okay.
God's covenant with Israel is often described using the imagery of marriage.
Right. So they're mirroring their own broken covenant with God.
Exactly.
Through divorce.
It becomes a powerful symbol of their unfaithfulness.
So we're seeing this pattern of resistance and rebellion, both in the religious leaders and the people, and it's not always outright defiance. Sometimes it's more subtle.
Right.
Like the next section where Malachi talks about self-deceit, it's like they've convinced themselves that evildoers are actually good in God's eyes.
Yeah, like they're trying to lower God's standards to justify their own behavior.
Right, and they even go so far as to question God's justice. Like, where is the God of justice?
It's easier to blame God than to confront our own shortcomings.
That's true, and that's where Malachi brings in this game changer.
Okay.
This mysterious figure known as Elijah the prophet.
Oh.
Okay, before we dive into Elijah, we're going to have to wrap up this part of the deep dive.
Okay.
But don't worry, we'll be back with part 2.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back. So last time we were talking about this figure, Elijah the prophet, and it sounded like things were about to get pretty intense.
Yeah, Elijah definitely seems like kind of a wild card. What exactly is his role here?
Well, Malachi describes him as a messenger who will prepare the way for God's judgment. It's like a cosmic reset button.
I was going to say, he sounds like he's there to shake things up.
Yeah, he's not coming to play around.
Okay, so what does this judgment look like? I mean, Malachi uses some pretty strong language. A refiner's fire, a launderer's soap.
Right, those aren't exactly gentle metaphors.
Yeah, not at all.
He's painting a vivid picture of purification, but it's a purification that comes through intense heat and scrubbing.
Ooh, so it's not going to be fun.
Probably not, but it's necessary to remove those impurities that have built up.
Okay, so it's not just about punishment, it's more like a refining process.
Exactly. It's about restoring them to a state of wholeness, a right relationship with God.
Okay, so before we get to the fire and brimstone, Malachi tackles another form of resistance, selfishness.
Right.
Specifically, the people are holding back on their tithes and offerings.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to play keep away with God.
Not a good idea.
No, not at all. He's the ultimate provider, and he's not amused by their games.
And he even challenges them to test him by bringing their full tithe and seeing if he doesn't pour out blessings.
He's saying, you think you know better than me? Put me to the test and see what happens when you live a life of generosity and trust.
That verse always gets me. It's so bold. I remember a time when I was going through a tough financial period, and the thought of tithing seemed impossible. But then I remembered that verse, and I decided to just try it out.
Wow.
And, it wasn't easy, but I took that step of faith, and things started to shift. I'm not saying it was like a magic solution, but it definitely changed my perspective. I started focusing more on what I had than what I lacked.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
It's amazing how those ancient principles can still speak to us today.
Yeah, and I think that's what Malachi is getting at when he contrasts the people's complaints about serving God with that picture of the arrogant prospering.
It seems like the world is upside down.
Yeah, totally.
This perceived injustice is a major source of their frustration and doubt. They look around and see the wicked getting away with everything while they struggle.
Right.
But Malachi offers a different perspective on what true prosperity looks like.
Okay, so we've moved from God's love and choice to the failings of the priests and people, and now we're getting into this picture of judgment and restoration. Malachi introduces this idea of a memory scroll, where God records the names of those who respect him.
It's like God's keeping a divine record of faithfulness.
And those names aren't just written down, they're treasured. God promises to spare the righteous like a father protecting his son.
It's a beautiful image of God's love and mercy, even amidst judgment.
And then we get this incredibly vivid imagery of the day of the Lord, a burning furnace for the wicked, but a sun of vindication with healing wings for the righteous.
Wow, that image of the sun with healing wings. It's so powerful. It's like
Yeah.
this juxtaposition of judgment and healing.
It's like there will be consequences, but also this incredible restoration.
Exactly.
And the righteous are skipping about like calves released from the stall.
Right. It's this image of pure joy.
Yeah, it's not just about gritting your teeth and enduring hardship. It's about experiencing this deep, abiding joy.
It's about embracing the fullness of life that God intended.
So we've been on quite a journey with Malachi. We've explored God's sovereignty, the shortcomings of the people, the promise of judgment and restoration. But then he shifts gears again.
And brings it back to the basics.
Yeah, back to the law of Moses. It's like he's saying, okay, you've heard the warnings, now here's what you need to do.
It's a call to action grounded in obedience.
And that call to action is embodied in the figure of Elijah,
Right.
who will come to encourage fathers and children to return to God.
It's a reminder that it's never too late to turn back, to choose a different path.
But it's not just about avoiding punishment.
Oh,
It's
man.
about experiencing the fullness of that covenant relationship with God,
Right.
that joy that we were just talking about.
And that brings us to the heart of Malachi's message.
Oh,
It's about repentance and faithfulness, not just for outward conformity, but for genuine inner transformation.
that's a perfect way to transition to our final part of the deep dive. All right, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Malachi.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. You know, we've covered God's sovereignty, the shortcomings of both the priests and the people, these warnings of judgment, but also these beautiful promises of restoration.
Yeah. And through it all, Malachi is really grappling with this question of what does it mean to be God's people,
Mm-hmm.
especially when things are tough, when they're facing hardship and uncertainty.
Yeah, it's like he's holding up this mirror to the community
Right.
and saying, hey, look at yourselves. Are you really living out your faith?
And I think that's what makes Malachi so relevant
Mm.
for us today.
Yeah,
It's a challenge for us to examine our own hearts.
absolutely. Are we walking the walk or just talking the talk?
Right. Are we giving God our best or are we holding back?
And I love how Malachi doesn't just point fingers. He offers a way forward,
Mm.
this call to return to the law of Moses.
Right. It's not about following rules for the sake of rules.
Right.
It's about living in right relationship with God.
Exactly. And that challenge to test God has always stuck with me.
That's bold.
It is. It's like he's saying, don't take my word for it. Put it into practice. See what happens.
It's an invitation to experience God's grace,
Mhm.
not in some distant future, but here and now in our everyday lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this question.
Okay.
What laws or principles might you need to re-examine in your own life?
What areas of complacency or hypocrisy might God be calling you to address?
Malachi reminds us that faithfulness is a journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's a daily choice to align our hearts with God's will, to walk in obedience, and to trust in his love and his provision.
And that journey leads to a life of joy.
Absolutely. A life that reflects the fullness of God's shalom.
It's a life worth striving for.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Malachi.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, keep diving deep.